I want to thank everybody for coming out this evening to this event. My name is Vincent Barletta. I'm a professor in the Department of Iberian and Latin American Cultures here at Stanford, and I'm currently serving as the director for the Abbasi program in Islamic Studies. Over the course of the 2011-2012 academic year, the Abbasi program in Islamic Studies will be sponsoring an event series titled We the People, Islam and U.S. Politics. This series will focus on the ever-changing place of Islam and Muslims in the contemporary American political discourse and its potential role for the future of American democracy, society, and culture. Bringing together academics, artists, and public intellectuals, the series will provide a forum for deep, critical conversations about America, as much as about Muslims and Islam in America. Participants will reflect on various aspects of American political life, such as the news and media and Hollywood, our event this evening, the visual arts, and democratic theory and practice. And I should say, as we approach the next election year, and I think the electoral cycle has already well begun, I'm very pleased that we've chosen this as our series this year. I feel that it's very much our responsibility as a university program. There's a general sense that the universities are here to inform citizens, to help us in our choices. I think we're about information, but largely we've perhaps ceded that to the internet. We're really about helping people make deeply, historically informed, critical decisions. So it's beyond information. I think the event tonight is about reflection as much as it is about information. It's about choosing a particular footing that one takes, not only with respect to Islam in the United States, but with respect to the United States. And I'll also say that as a program focused on Islamic studies, it also makes sense for us to talk in this American context about the elections. In a secular society, there's probably no moment at which citizens most closely approximate the activity of prayer than when they're voting. You walk into a booth, you close the curtain behind you, or at least that's how we vote in my precinct. You put your head down, you invoke the best in you, and you make a choice. You take a leap. And that leap has consequences not only for you and your relationship with whatever guides you, but also it has consequences for the world around you and for the world that will be there after you. And so it is a very, very charged moment. And we at the Abbasi program very much want to help the people who attend our events and our community and the broader community beyond to make decisions that are informed by history and by a critical consideration of events. Okay. We have three very distinguished speakers tonight, and I'm going to speak a little bit about each of them, and then I will cede the microphone to them in turn, after which there will be a question and answer session. So we have in the middle chair, Camille Alik, who is the program director of Muslims on Screen and Television, MOST. She's responsible for the overall development of the program, oversight of research projects and requests of writers and producers, as well as strategy for growth. In addition, she develops and maintains relationships with the entertainment community, and she helps to facilitate introductions between industry in the United States and abroad. This is complemented by the planning and hosting of special events and dialogues throughout the year. Camille acts as an intermediary between clients and resource experts, administering resource services and maintaining the MOST website and an office at the USC School of Cinematic Arts. Before coming to MOST, she was with the Writers Guild of America, where she coordinated and planned events and activities within the organizing department, including independent film, animation, video games, and public policy. We're very happy to have her here today to speak about not only the relationship, the very charged relationship between Islam and Hollywood, but also emerging media such as video games and other digital media. Closest to me is Joel Brinkley. Joel Brinkley is the Hearst Visiting Professional in Residence. He joined the Department of Communication here at Stanford in the fall of 2006 after a 23-year career with the New York Times. There he served as a reporter, editor, and Pulitzer Prize-winning foreign correspondent. At Stanford, he writes a weekly op-ed column on foreign affairs that appears in about 50 newspapers and websites in the United States and around the world each week, syndicated by Tribune Media Services. He's also a foreign affairs writer for Politico and maintains an active public speaking career. His areas of research include American foreign policy and foreign affairs in general, as well as the future of the nation's newspaper industry. He's a native of DC, a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. No? Okay. He began his journalism career at the Associated, generally that brings cheers. So. He began his journalism career at the Associated Press and over the following years worked for the Richmond, Virginia News Leader and the Louisiana Courier Journal before joining the Times in 1983. At the Times, he served as a Washington correspondent as well as a foreign correspondent for several decades, basically. He is the author of 5 books, including Cambodia's Curse, The Modern History of a Troubled Land, The U.S. versus Microsoft, The Inside Story of the Landmark Case, Defining Vision, The Battle for the Future of Television, The Circus Master's Mission, a novel, published by Random House in '89, The Iran-Contra Affair with Steve Engelberg, published by Times Books in 1988. He's also contributed to many books, and he is here today to speak largely about the role of print media and journalism. Finally, Michael Wolff. He is the co-founder of Unity Productions Foundation and co-executive producer for UPF Films. For 15 years, he was publisher of Timbuktu Books, a small press that published poetry and avant-garde prose. Michael's first books on Islam were The Hajj, a first-person travel account, and 1,000 Roads to Mecca, an anthology of 10 centuries of travelers' writing. After September 11th, he edited Taking Back Islam, American Muslims Reclaim Their Faith, which won a 2003 Wilbur Award. In 1997, Wolff hosted a televised account of the Hajj from Mecca for Nightline. The program was nominated for a Peabody, Emmy, George Polk, and National Press Club Awards. In 2003, Wolff worked with CNN international reporter Zain Verjee to produce a documentary on the Hajj. Michael is the co-editor of UPF's Hollywood engagement program called MOST, Muslims on Screen and Television, which works with writers and producers to develop more true-to-life characters and storylines of Muslims on television and in films. If we could give a round of applause for our 3 participants, and we'll begin.
Thank you very much, Vincent. I appreciate the welcome, and good evening. Nice to see all of you here tonight. As he said, my name is Camille Alec, and I'm the program director for Most Resource. We are a service that provides complimentary resources, research, and access to experts to Hollywood for any of their storylines or characters involving Muslims, Islam, or the Middle East. I came to this via the Writers Guild of America West, where, as he said, I was working with writers, video game writers, independent film, and animation predominantly. And I was lucky enough to run across Michael and Cynthia coming through the Guild. They were the co-founders, along with Brookings, Gallup, and Unity Productions Foundation, to create this service. After speaking with many in Hollywood about the depictions that they were seeing or lack of depictions that they were seeing, they found that Hollywood really needed access to accurate, authentic, credible information, but with non-advocacy attached. And that's where Most Resource was born. So since then, we've held worked with many shows in Hollywood, and that's one of the things that we do. We provide timely information. When a show is writing a storyline, we go in and help them with whatever their needs may be. A living example, oftentimes, access to an ambassador if that's what they need, or actually research. We've even fanned out and found living examples. Many of those writers are already curious about that kind of thing. Most of them are not of that background, so it's not they don't know it firsthand. And so that's where we help them. So on that note, I'm going to show you one clip from The Good Wife. This show has been doing a lot of work in this area over the course of 2 or 3 seasons, so we'll show you a clip from that. So you get the idea. A lot of these shows are exploring themes, and we have noticed a change in Hollywood. They have taken a step back from the depictions that you were seeing in the past. What we're finding at most is they have not been as there haven't been as many representations replacing it. So the flat terrorists that you used to see maybe even 10 years ago, they've stepped back. In fact, there was a research study done recently, and they're showing that most of them being depicted now are showing as white homegrown terrorists. That is what's ultimately being shown. But we need more positive portrayals, or we use more authentic and diverse depictions, is how we like to put it. Moving forward from that, in addition to providing resources and research to TV and film, we also create room for dialogue. So we need to create a space for a safe environment for them to interact. So we host a few events a year, usually with Hollywood, and we bring in policy and experts and allow them an environment where they know they're not going to be quoted or it's not going to be broadcast, so that they can exchange real information. I'm just going to go quickly through a few photos from some of our events and give you a feel for the types of events that we do. So this was our launch in Los Angeles. This was at the Paley Center for Media. You can see the crowd shot. These are executives, producers, TV and film writers, actors. And you can see that was our panel and Michael and I. That was Nashwa El-Rawani from the Middle East. She's a TV host and also a producer of Poet of Millions. Saad Mohseni, who is the CEO of Tolo Television from Afghanistan. Cynthia Schneider, our othermost co-director, and Walter Parks. He's an executive producer of many films, including Amistad, Gladiator, Men in Black, Kite Runner. And as you can see, Michael and myself. And then you can see that was on the stage. The next event that I wanted to highlight is we did one based on Iran, and it was right after the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences went to Iran with a delegation. So this followed the Green Wave movement and that election. And so we brought in people from the delegation and also others from Hollywood to have an exchange about what that trip was like for them, and have also experts in the room to download with them. Some of the things that they found were shocking to them, although not surprising to many of us, that they actually found Iranians actually liked Americans. They were very welcome and warm in their homes. And really the ultimate goal of this conversation, what came out of it, was how do societies get to know each other when governments aren't speaking? And how can arts and culture help with that? In this photo, actually, that's the former chairman of Lionsgate, Dean Elizabeth Daly at USC, who's been a big supporter of ours, and Bill Horberg, who's the executive producer on Milk. He was also on the Kite Runner, Death at a Funeral. Then you can see Sid Ganis. He was the president of the Academy at the time. This one was more recent. This was Spotlight on Egypt, and we actually had a very small dinner this time. So we went from a very large kind of group at the Paley Center, 150 guests, to doing these very small, intimate dinners. This one we had Shadi Hamid out of Brookings, Howard Gordon from 24, and one of the Born Identity writers. And you can see on the far end of the screen is Khalid Abulnaga, who was in Tahrir Square all 18 days of the protests. He's also a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador. And really, in this dialogue, they really found a lot about Sharia, asked questions about it, the Muslim Brotherhood, things that they might not feel comfortable asking in a public setting. And you can see Michael addressing in the introduction. Also in this dinner were 2 writers from The Good Wife who ended up writing about the Arab Spring in the season opener this year. And this was our last one. It discussed comedy and news and how it addresses Islamophobia with the Daily Show writers, Colbert Nation, and it was our first foray in New York. And we also had a lot of writers and reporters from ABC News and all that join us. And president of the Writers Guild in New York, and Steve Inskeep from the Morning Edition on NPR. You can see the panel. And this one I'm backing up. We actually did this before. This is actually a panel we did on video games, because that's the last thing we're going to address. That's Peter Singer in the center. He's the foremost expert on modern warfare and robotics in warfare, and talks about drones and things like that with the crowd. We also had Evan Wright, who's on the far end of the screen, and he wrote HBO's Generation Kill, was embedded with the Americans, and you can see Peter Weller from RoboCop. And there's our panel with John Horn from the LA Times moderating, and you can see THQ on the screen, which is one of the big video game companies. So where does this take us? So most has been addressing television, movies, and video games. Most recently, video games. Why do we go after video games? A $40 billion a year industry. In fact, LA Times said in February, Americans spent in that month alone $1.36 billion on video games. So it's a massive marketplace. How is diversity in video games? Well, it's not surprising. Actually, not just Muslims in video games, but all diversity in video games. They're very underrepresented. I think Latinos only represent about 3% of all depictions in that market. African Americans are also underserved. And where is this coming from? Most video game purchasers are 35-year-old male white. Also in the design game, mostly white male people working in the industry. So we need to do a better job not only of attracting young talent that is diverse, but also having the consumer buy things that are, or move away from buying things that don't have depictions. You are seeing more of that as mobile platforms and other devices are coming into the field. Facebook has 200 million users a month playing video games on that platform. And also as these international marketplaces are opening up, a lot of those people are designing their own games, which brings me to our last little thing. We are going to show indie games also are a big push in this area. Viewer? So this one I'm going to show you because, like I said, a lot of the big companies are showing first-person shooter games and things like that. These are very large markets, very expensive games to make. $20 million to build a virtual world, so they have to sell multiple titles. This one, though, however, won IndieCAD this year. Much smaller game, only about 100 million players so far, but it's winning awards, and so we wanted to show you a glimpse of it. Okay, so you can see that's an example of a documentary game that was made at USC Game Innovation Lab. And that was it's about a 10-minute game. It's free to download, and free to play is actually a big market now. So that's the kind of example you're seeing coming out of indie games. It's sort of like how independent film has been an alternative for the big blockbusters in Hollywood, and also creates room for people to show a different form expression. And on that note, I'm actually going to throw it to Michael Wolf, because he's actually also working on something similar to that.
Well, I would just briefly add, in this free player game. There is an economy to the business, but it doesn't operate on selling $50 packets to hundreds of millions of kids around the world. There's a different way in which it works. And I'm working with someone here in Silicon Valley right now, Umair Khan, who has a very interesting game on Facebook called Secret Builders. And we're designing something for the Hajj, a medieval adventure game for 8 to 80, where you manage a caravan across tough terrain in the Middle Ages and get yourself eventually to Mecca. So there are a lot of different ways to develop the world of gaming. And it is a huge industry with a lot of pleasurable influence to it. So that would be my little addition to your comments. Now that you're sitting down, I guess
Yeah, I was going
I'm
to
the next addition. So, good evening. When Vincent sent me an email to say that I had a little time to reflect upon Islam and Muslims and the media, I took him seriously and wrote down a few remarks, just taking a look back. We're so involved in the present day, and I am so involved in my current activities, that it was really a nice opportunity to think about having been a Muslim, as I am, and working in the national U.S. media in various ways for now about 25 years. And that began as a book writer, and then kind of flourished into television journalism and then documentary filmmaking. And as I just mentioned, video gaming and scripting and all kinds of things. Over those 25 years, I spent a lot of time looking for new frames for Americans to view Muslims and Islam, and then trying to produce media through which people can observe and learn and find out more through books and films and websites and so on. Over the years, there have been difficulties in being a Muslim in America. The good things about being a Muslim in America remain pretty constant. The freedom of speech, the chance to be prosperous, the relative chance that you won't go to jail for being a little different. These are all fairly constant benefits of being in this country. But the difficulties of being a Muslim in the United States change every few years, at least in my observation. And today, I often hear Muslims say, oh, before 9/11, it was very easy to be a Muslim here, but that's not really true. When I, for example, became a Muslim in around 1987, things were not that good. Most Americans were passively suspicious of Islam. I knew very few Muslims, and I had a lot of friends who were American. And I know that as for Islam, they almost never thought about it. But if it did come up, then they raised an eyebrow. They had their doubts. I don't remember at this point all of the details of their doubts. But back then, when I told most of my American friends that I was becoming a Muslim and going to Mecca on a pilgrimage, the reactions were very strong and puzzled. Some people thought Islam was at war with Judaism or with Christianity. Others had other ideas. Since my mother was a Christian and my father was Jewish, my new choices presented a variety of challenges. More often, people believed that Islam was inherently violent or un-American. Others just wondered why adopting any religion was very sensible, and I got that a lot. I had to remind them that I wasn't asking them to change their point of view, I was just changing mine. They were seeing Islam through the lens of historical European history and, to some degree, propaganda. and through the lenses of a media that in the late 80s was already strongly influenced by radical factions on both sides of the equation. Just as today, a lot of Americans view Islam through these horrible eyeglasses that Osama bin Laden fitted them out with 10 years ago. Even 25 years ago, from inside Islam and outside Islam too, people in the West were being made to fear a society that, compared to the US or Europe, was relatively powerless. I don't need to talk here about 9/11. Somewhere on some campus every week of the year now, there is a conference about the effects of 9/11 on something. US foreign policy, American society, the price of oil, the price of toothpaste, as if the people in this room and on this planet hadn't lived through it thoroughly already. Being a Muslim today in the US is actually challenging for very different reasons than prevailed in the wake of 9/11. I'll just name two of those. Now, in 2011, we have a news media partly bullied and partly led by the no's, and I'm speaking largely of TV, but to some degree, newspapers, into telling misleading and somewhat inflammatory stories by a small number of anti-Muslim muckrakers financed by powerful interests behind the scenes. Examples of two stories floated in this way out of kind of the far right field are the Quran burning in Florida, which reached quite a height of airtime and attention and ink at one point not too long ago. A story that should never have made it onto national TV, for example, a Bush League bigot broadcasting from a trailer in Orlando. And another, the confusion of Faisal Ralph's Lower Manhattan Community Center with a Ground Zero mosque, a transmogrification that flowed from Pam Geller's keyboard in New Jersey primarily. One keyboard. Politicians, movie stars, and other artists pay millions a year to get their names and their issues on the tips of the national media's tongue. How did stories like this make it there for nothing? As of about 6 weeks ago, we have an answer to that question. It may not be the answer, but we have an answer. It didn't happen for nothing. Apparently, over $41 million in contributions have now been traced from half a dozen interested foundations to a handful of bloggers and Muslim watch sites to help create an election time wedge issue of suspicion and fear about Muslims. So that's one difficulty that we're living with in 2011, which was not a part of the landscape in 9/11 days. Our radio airwaves are likewise flooded with really radical anti-Muslim language of a very nasty kind, and I think most of you may have stumbled upon an AM station or another in your driving time, in which, I don't know, I'm just assuming, because it is so pervasive, that you've heard some of this really hateful language being shoveled out by the pound. If it's possible to show a short clip, in response to this kind of real massive assault of language on the airwaves, and particularly on the radio, we put up a website a couple of months ago called myfellowamerican.us. And we made a little 2-minute film because, more than 2 minutes no one would watch. We usually make long-form documentaries, hour, 2 hours. So we made a little 2-minute film just grabbing some of this language off the radio. And then the images that you see are somewhat different. So it's a kind of a high contrast piece, which forms the center of a website, which is meant to be a platform where people can come and have a little more peaceful say about Muslims they might know, rather than stereotypes and objectifications of people that most of the speakers you will hear don't even know. Is there sound?
Islam at this moment is responsible for more pain, more bloodshed, more devastation than nearly any other force on earth. You need to stop saying that the God of Islam and the God of Christianity are the same God. They're not the same God. Islam intends through violence to conquer the world.
Make no bones about it. That is pure, unadulterated evil.
And Americans need to wake up.
And throw him out of my country. I'd raise the American flag and I'd get out my trumpet if you did it. Without due process. I'm not going to put my wife in a hijab, and I'm not going to put my daughter in a burqa, and I'm not getting on my all fours and praying in Mecca, and you could drop dead if you don't like it. What kind of religion is this? What kind of world are you living in that you let them in here with that throwback document in their hand, which is a book of hate? Don't tell me I need re-education. They need deportation. About Islam. I don't want to hear one more word about Islam. Take your religion and shove it up your behind.
American politicians state that the vast majority of Muslims living in the United States are just ordinary people who love America and are loyal to America. Is that true? Is that really true?
I can't begin to tell you how important it is that we understand the true nature of Islam, that we see it for what it really is.
Police say the 17-year-olds broke several windows with an iron rod and slashed tires on a van. According to the report, Gonzalez Baca told police that, quote, all Muslims are terrorists.
So in addition to this nasty speech in the public square and on the election trail this summer, NPR and several reputable newspapers reported on a strong, new, pretty widespread wave of police community profiling that's going on, coupled with a lot of bad training materials about Islam in the FBI, in the military, and elsewhere. So these two very recent difficulties emerged, carrying their own dire threat. The risk that enough Americans will swallow the election wedge issue, anti-Muslim hype, to look the other way, while officials seeking cheap votes use scare tactics to propose state house resolutions, which is going on right now in about 24 states, demonizing American citizens who honor something called Sharia, and who happen to be Muslims. From there, the way is open for a lot of further trouble if you happen to be American and Muslim. And so, in a way, we are back to a problem I first experienced in the 1980s, a passivity in the public square, a passivity of unconscious suspicion, a worry, and a fear. Does the formulation, as we speak, of these anti-Sharia resolutions in dozens of state houses take an analogy with, say, McCarthyism out of the loopy land of conspiracy theory and bring it close to reality, maybe too close for comfort? It's a very worrisome question. I don't think the answer is yes. It's not the 1950s anymore. And I believe that it's the media that actually makes the difference here. Because we've experienced a revolution in the media since the 1950s. The freedom to complicate the news, to offer competing views and counter hard reporting with better informed sources, coupled with a revolution in the home entertainment industry too, have all gone a long way to keep the large, educated classes of Americans well aware of what it feels like to be sold a bill of goods. There was no Daily Show in 1950. There was no Colbert Report. There was no PBS either. There were not hundreds of cable channels, and there was no Al Jazeera. Americans have had a channel selector in their hands for over 30 years now, and the public sense of irony has greatly improved. Discrimination and what I would call a pretty good crap detector are part of the working equipment of people in this country today. Those people are my audience, not Rupert Murdoch. Television entertainment has been transformed too. Since at least the 1980s, it has been a platform for normalizing groups of outsiders into American mainstream life, as Bill Cosby did for African Americans, as Murphy Brown and a host of other programs have done for American women in the workplace in the 90s until today. Series programming after series programming. These are programs not to be dismissed. We tend to dismiss entertainment TV, but something has happened in entertainment TV in the last 5 to 10 years. We all should look up and take notice of it. It is that these programs are watched routinely by return audiences. People come back week after week, year after year, 10 to 15 million viewers every week. Because of this, TV has really surpassed feature film, for example, in its social clout. And it has constantly improved its production values so that there's nothing creaky about the production values of television any longer. Whereas feature film is really a poor financial model, TV is a financial boom. Every year since 2003 or so, we've been seeing more and better programming. And with that, a greater willingness to occasionally present nuanced stories about Muslims as part of the American mix. At the same time, PBS, History Channel, National Geographic, and others have gone from a zero understanding of their audience's interest in Muslims and Islam to a real comprehension of how important these communities and these themes may be to their own programming future. When I and my group set out to make a film about the Prophet Muhammad and modern American Muslims in 1999, PBS, CPB, the NEH, and every other major funding agency in the country showed no interest in this. 10 years later, it is, I won't say easy, but at any rate, quite possible to interest large institutions in entertainment and educational value, in the entertainment and educational value of long-form documentaries on Muslim themes. I myself have now made and broadcast nationally 8 such films, an hour to 2 hours long. DVDs and lesson plans for every one of them have gone into thousands, tens of thousands of classrooms. Our films are shown on Capitol Hill, the state and justice departments. So this isn't 1950, and it isn't 2000 either. It's now. And how we respond in the media, in the news, in particularly, I believe, in television entertainment, is going to have a lot to do with paving the way for introducing what is essentially a new community. Not very much more vilified than the Japanese in the Second World War, not very much more vilified than the Italians in 1910 and 1915, not much more vilified than the Chinese at the turn of the last century, the Yellow Peril, etc. We have a new group of people in the country. And I believe it's up to us to make some sense of their presence here. And one of the real ways that this is happening is in living rooms around the country in a nightly way, because these series television entertainment programs are picking up stories and more stories. I had about 15 minutes. I probably overshot it. We have some questions. I just wanted to give you a little sort of rounded picture of how things look from here. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I've spoken at this podium several times, and I've learned that given the introduction, you're probably expecting me to be ponderous, self-important, condescending, patronizing, and maybe even a little arrogant. I'm usually only able to provide about 3 of those. but I'll try to do better this evening. I'm going to talk about the print media's role in covering Islam, and the reason we were restricted to print, I was originally asked to talk about the news media in general, but I don't watch 10 minutes of TV news a year. I have no respect for it. That is where most of the problems we're talking about this evening occur. So I'm going to talk about what I know, and that's the print media. And when you talk about the news media right now, all the talk seems to be about the so-called new media, bloggers. Well, bloggers, I have to tell you, are not journalists. They are individuals who put their opinions online. There was a study a few years ago by the Pew Research Center that showed that 85% of blogs were derivative of something that was already out there in a newspaper or a magazine and spun with that person's opinion. That's what blogs are. They're not journalism. We in the print media are often called the legacy media in a slightly derisive way, though every newspaper in the United States has a vibrant website. But let's step back for a minute and think about this. How many foreign correspondents does the Huffington Post have? How about Talking Point Memo or any of the blogs we're talking about, or Drudge Report? How often do bloggers go abroad and do actual reporting? I think you know the answer. What about TV news? TV news has almost zero foreign correspondents. They laid most of them off 5 or 6 years ago when they started getting in financial trouble. NBC, I just noticed, has one chief foreign correspondent, and he's, I believe, the only one who actually lives abroad. The others go abroad when something happens. But right now, even at a time when most newspapers have shrunk, the fact is that 80% of the news you see, hear, or read first appeared in a newspaper, a derivative of something that first appeared in a newspaper. A close friend of mine was a producer for 2020, and she's an investigative reporter, one of the few in the broadcast world. She worked abroad quite a lot. And when she'd get an idea, she would take it to her senior producer and ask, "Can I do this?" And he would look at her and said, "Has this appeared in a paper anyplace?" And she'd say, "No." "Well, no." So sometimes when I was still at the Times, she would send me a story idea and ask me to write the story so she could get permission to do it again. A long time ago, John Chancellor, who was the anchor person for NBC News, told me that he used to pad to his front door every morning and pick up the New York Times to see, quote, whether we played our stories correctly. That's still true. Newspapers dominate news in this country, even in our winnowed state. And as a veteran newspaper journalist and a foreign correspondent, I've spent many years working in the Middle East, and I'm going to talk to you about how we in newspaper journalism cover the Middle East, and we will talk about some of the things that were brought up by previous speakers later. Actually, I guess I'm still a newspaper foreign correspondent because my column runs in newspapers and I travel abroad every summer. And I want to share with you a founding principle of newspaper foreign correspondence, which we take with us wherever we travel. It is this: it is absolutely inappropriate for American journalists to carry their own values and expectations, born of growing up in the United States, and apply them, impose them on another society, and to judge their people accordingly. That is a guideline that we use. It sounds simple, doesn't it? But actually it's quite complicated because there's an exception, a big fuzzy one. I'm not going to impose my lifestyle choices on another country, but we all carry within us certain fundamental human values. We believe that we should have, and should we apply worldwide, even though they're now enshrined in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights adopted in 1948 without a dissenting vote? For example, we know that stealing is wrong. I don't think anybody in the world would tell you that stealing isn't wrong. So do we write about corruption with any judgment? Murder is wrong. But what about genital mutilation? A custom in some countries are pedophilia, very common in Afghanistan, or child marriage in Saudi Arabia, where a senior cleric recently issued a fatwa, quote, "Those who are calling for a minimum age for marriage should fear God and not violate his laws. Scholars have agreed that it is permissible for fathers to marry off their young daughters, even if they are in the cradle, but it isn't permissible for their husbands to have sex with them unless they are capable of being placed beneath and bearing the weight." Is that wrong? Everybody will make his own judgment. Very often you find local customs in all sorts of countries, not just Islamic countries, are simply wrong. I spent several summers in Southeast Asia writing a book about Cambodia. And the government seizes land from individuals and kicks them off and sells them to developers. And most people have post-traumatic stress disorder, but the government doesn't pay any attention. I found that to be wrong. These are fuzzy areas. One country, only one, does not allow women to drive. Is that wrong? One way to decide, not always the best way, is to ask the women themselves how they feel about it. Are they upset? Sometimes making decisions like this, and they're difficult, reminds me of the way hogs in eastern Kentucky, where I worked years ago, they take a hog and put them on one end of a balance, a seesaw sort of thing, and then on the other end they stack some rocks, and then they try to guess how much the rocks weigh. It's just about that logical. It's not easy for people from the West actually to work in the Islamic world. You have to watch yourself all the time. I was working in Iraq a few years ago when I was still at the Times, and I'd been in discussions with a foreign editor at that time, and he had mentioned that the Middle East bureau chief based in Cairo and covering the Arab world was open and wanted to know if I was interested. Well, shortly after that conversation, I had to go down to Basra on the Persian Gulf coast. I was interviewing the families of death squad victims. I remember walking down a neighborhood street, and we passed a trash dumpster. I had already smelled it from only a block away. The dumpster was full and overflowing, and mounds of trash of all sorts lay in fetid piles all around it. Surrounding it with a buzz that sounded like a chainsaw was thousands upon thousands of flies. Right there looking at that, and the stench, I gasped, and I wondered to myself, do I want to live amid this kind of squalor for years? The paradox is that you go into any Arab home, and they, in Basra or any place else, and the houses are picture perfect clean, and the only odor you're going to smell is the smell of coffee that they're about to serve you. So this tells you one thing: the people don't want to live amid squalor, but their governments provide no services except to collect taxes and bribes. Garbage collection maybe every few months. So you think about that one moment in my particular life. I went to Basra to cover death squads that killed a dozen people in the previous week, and I happened to walk past that foul mountain of garbage. What kind of image does that give you about Basra? And how do we, in the print media, portray the Arab world? In the story I wrote that day, I didn't mention the garbage, of course, and here's a small excerpt from what I did write, picking up midway through. This has been a time for revenge in Basra, the second city of Iraq. Mohammed Abdul Aghishi was the principal of an elementary school and a senior Ba'ath Party official under Saddam Hussein. When the war came, he lost his job, and Wednesday afternoon he took a taxi to the education ministry to see if officials would hire him. As he stood in the street in front of the ministry building, a white Toyota sedan with no license plates pulled up. A man in the passenger seat opened the window and shot Mr. Ghishi in the head with an AK-47, the police said. His brother Latif wept at a wake on Friday morning as he said, "I saw him lying on the street. My son and I carried him on our shoulders to his grave." What role does the print media play in shaping the broader American view of the Islamic world? We have horrific crimes in this country too. There was one in Seattle a couple of months ago where a father shot and killed his wife and 3 young children, then shot himself after setting his house on fire. But I would say we play a critical role. We tried very hard to be straight, as in the story I just read from, no matter our personal feelings, but also because no one else goes where we go. No one else sees what we see. I was in the office of a prominent Palestinian pollster in Ramallah in August, and he had some very extremely interesting data about Palestinians living in the diaspora. As many of you know, one of the big debates between Israel and the Palestinians right now is the insistence that any of the Palestinian people who were forced out of the country when Israel was formed in 1948 should have the right of return to their former homes, counting all the descendants. Millions of people. Israel objects, saying it would change the demographic balance of the state, while Shakaki's firm did a several-month survey of Palestinians and found that only 6% said they had any interest whatsoever in returning to their family homes in Israel, should the peace ever come. 6%. That changes the entire debate. I told him how surprised I was to hear that. How come no one had reported this? Well, the only journalists who had been in to see him in recent years were from a Palestinian news service and one each from the New York Times and the Washington Post. They'd come with their questions about their own stories. No broadcasters, no internet or new media journalists, none ever. In fact, that kind of story with no visuals holds no appeal for broadcast journalism. So I told you about the squalor in Basra. 3 years ago, I was in Beryllus, Egypt, in northern Egypt, and wrote this column, a gaggle of pleasant peasant women, black caftans wafting in the breeze, crouched in the street over a small tray of fish, just caught, but already teeming with flies. I guess I'm taken with flies. In their excited chatter, they sounded as if they had acquired a rarefied commodity of untold value, and by their own measure they had. The worldwide food crisis has spawned high-level meetings and cogent-sounding strategies proclaimed by leaders of the wealthy nations that caused it. But when looking for results, come to places like this, one of the most impoverished towns in an exceedingly poor country, and people who live here, like the women trying to mete out the fish, say simply, "We're hungry." No one seems to listen. No one seems to care. That's another portrayal of an Islamic country, and I didn't see any new media or broadcast journalists in Beryllus either. In any case, Egypt has changed governments since I wrote that, of course, and Iraq has changed governments since I wrote that story from Basra. And of course, so has Tunisia, Libya, and soon enough, I expect, Syria and Yemen. How likely is it, do you think, that the new governments will begin picking up the garbage in Basra and in the rest of Iraq and feed the peasant women in Beryllus? I'm not so confident. So what will the Western print cover? We'll still cover death squads, the garbage, and the hungry women, just as we cover the underside of society in the United States. You know, there's an aphorism we use to describe what we do as journalists. We don't write about the planes that don't crash. We write about things that are unusual, like the peasant women, unusual from our point of view. Our view, I'm afraid, as educated, relatively well-off Americans who don't know anyone who's hungry. Yes, we try not to carry our values with us and impose them on other societies, but some things are ingrained within us. I doubt that any Egyptian journalist visiting Beryllus when I did, assuming he was allowed to write what he wanted at that time, or even at this time, to be honest with you, would come away with the same impression I did. Would he write about those women? I doubt it. As I said, we had to flee because we learned that the Egyptian police were chasing us for daring to have spoken to these women. But then in our journalism program right now, we have an Asian student who's struck with the difference in income, education, and living standards between East Palo Alto and Palo Alto, here in this extremely wealthy nation. That's a great story as she sees it, and I agree. She mentions this story to several of us faculty members, and I have to admit, most of us shrugged, sort of nonplussed, because we are inured to this side of American life. It takes a foreigner to see it. For her, it is a good story, no doubt. I wrote a story for Politico on Afghanistan last month and noted something most people don't know. Afghanistan is arguably the most impoverished and primitive nation on earth. UN figures show that it has the world's highest infant mortality rate. 144 of 1,000 children die before they reach their first birthday. By age 5, 26% of the children are dead. For those children who survive, 60% suffer from stunting, meaning they will be short and not very smart because of malnutrition during the first years of life. That is also the world's worst rate. So I showed the Politico story to an Afghan journalist who is a visiting fellow here this year, and he seemed nonplussed. Yeah, he said with a shrug, you know, you don't see that written about very often. It's the flip side of the same thing. As much as we try not to judge our other countries based on our own values, what's news to me is always going to be different from what is news to the people in the country I cover, and vice versa. So it will always be. That's human nature. I'll conclude with one more example of differing impressions of the same scene. During my first assignment in Israel years ago, I wrote a long profile for the Prime Minister then, a fellow named Yitzhak Shamir. I spent a lot of time with the man and found him to be rather unappealing on a personal level, a humorless little fellow. Well, I decided I was not going to say it just like that, and I didn't want to offend him. Still, I made passing mention of the fact that Shamir is not tall, and I noted that he's not blessed with a great wit or a soothing public manner. Well, the Israeli press loved to pick up what we wrote, and the next morning the newspaper Hadashot typified the translation problems that also occurred, and the 6-column lead headline of the newspaper was, "New York Times calls Shamir a stupid dwarf." Well, that caused me a few problems, as you might imagine, as always happens when Western journalists cover the Middle East. Thank you.
So thanks very much to all three of you, and I guess it falls to me now as moderator to sort of kick off the questions. In listening to all three of those presentations, you know, I try to find a common thread, something, you know, a question that might create a conversation for all three of you, for all four of us, and for the rest of the room. And the thing that really struck me in all three of these talks is the extent to which we talk about the media almost over the events that occur. And the sort of the power of not only just the new media, digital media, television and whatnot, which is, you know, obviously, you know, impossible to ignore, but also just the power of the stories that are told, the power of narrative in print media or digital or however like. And I can cite a personal example. When I was a kid growing up in the 70s in Oakland, I had a lot of contact with Muslims, and they were all African American Muslims, part of the Nation of Islam. And so, to me, that was Islam. My sense of what Islam was that it was a very American thing. I mean, I didn't have perhaps a consciousness of the world sort of beyond the East Bay. And so for me, I had a very positive sense of Islam. And it was a very local, to me, a very local religion. And then, you know, as I got older, I mean, I must have been maybe 11, when the American embassy in Tehran was taken. And so then this opens up my personal media consciousness of Islam as a world religion. And then all of those, you know, my early childhood of nothing but sort of positive, very direct contact with Muslims was almost wiped out with one stroke by the stories that were being told about all of a sudden this clash of civilizations. That notion all of a sudden came into my very, very young consciousness. And the rest of my adult life has largely been, at some level, perhaps paradoxically, trying to get back almost to that earlier sense of it, the earlier sense of what Islam is within the United States, as a very sort of positive and a very American phenomenon. And so I guess I'd ask, you know, perhaps an open question for all three of you. What can you say not only about the way that the media shape our notion of Islam, but the way that the media And our perhaps unhealthy fixation on the media as media can simply overwrite actual direct experience. Even when we, in your stories, you're talking about things where people are not going to have a direct experience. But even when we do have direct experience with a particular phenomenon, often the stories that get told in the media, whether digitally or in print, have the incredible power to overwrite what we have even seen and touched with our own eyes and with our own hands. And so, since you work in this, what is your sense of the power and how we're to move forward, given the power?
Well, what you're describing really is a neurological fact.
Mm-hmm.
The neurologists reckon that it takes 14 positive impressions to wipe out a negative impression. and if you look back 50 or 100,000 years, where the saber-toothed tiger is a little more important than where the Valley of Blooms is, So it's you might say, this is what neurologists say, it has to do with survival, but it's a kind of a hardwired fact. So if, as Joel says, we're involved in print journalism and in journalism in general, in not writing about the planes that fly, but writing about that one that went down. Another way of saying that is, if it bleeds, it leads. If the bad news is the news, then from my point of view, and kind of going back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, I think the entertainment media is a counterbalance to this. I think this is where we get the stories. There's beautiful journalism being written of individuals out moving in the world. And it's very powerful and very affecting. And some of it is at book length, and some of it is at article length, and some of it is in the morning news. But it's storytelling fragments that are gathered around the plane going down. Storytelling as a kind of fireside experience that human beings have been participating in for ever, as long as we've had language, is a different quality. It carries different information. And there is a sense in which that, funny as it may sound, particularly to us who are so literate and intellectual, that glowing screen in the living room is the fireside. It is the fire right now. It is where people are sitting around, and we may choose not to watch it. I don't watch a lot of television. For someone who works in TV, I watch blessed little TV. But nonetheless, it is where some very important storytelling takes place, and I think of it as a kind of a counterbalance. So I'm thinking now, and then I'll stop, of one TV program that we worked with a couple of years ago. This young girl coming from Baghdad. All they told us in the writer's room for this particular show was, we want to do 4 programs on a young girl who is injured in an accidental bombing in her own home. She goes back in the house to get something, and the bomb goes off, and she is sent to the United States, as many kids have been, for surgery to correct this problem, and she is on an army base when the program opens up. And there are 4 one-hour programs in which she is a theme in the story until she goes back. Well, she goes to Turkey in the end. That's all they knew. They didn't know her name, they didn't have an actress, they didn't really know how she was going to take this business of being on an American army base coming from Baghdad. They had really not a clue about a lot of this. But by the time we had talked it over and they had put their considerable intellectual efforts to this, they came up with some amazing storytelling. These people who are working in entertainment TV are really excellent storytellers now. This is not what was going on in the 70s, when we kind of turned something on, oh, you can't hardly believe it, it's so bad. The best of this programming is really rather elegant. And I say that being essentially a literary person. This is hard for me to say. So, storytelling.
I would add to that really why I believe in what we do with most is, I read the newspapers too, and I still look to the newspaper for my news, so I appreciate your presentation. Unfortunately, most Americans don't. They aren't, newspaper subscriptions are dropping drastically, and unfortunately many of my friends in that industry are hurting. So where do people get their information? They turn on the television, almost all of them, and most people go online. And you think you're watching a narrative story, we turn on The Good Wife, we turn on The Simpsons, we turn on whatever show is popular at the time. And you think, but everybody knows this is this is fiction, this is not reality. But these shows get 20 million viewers a week, every week, coming into this person's home. And they watch that television and they believe what they see, even though it's a fictional story. And we know this because we're modeled after another organization called Hollywood Health and Society that does the same thing we do, but for healthcare, and the CDC backs it. And they feed health information through the medical shows. And many Americans, they actually do research on this, will spike, they did prostate cancer, right after they air that episode, spikes go up in people going to the doctors, getting tested for prostate cancer. They did a show on HIV. If a woman is pregnant and she's HIV positive, what is the percentage of births that the child will be HIV positive as well? They did a survey before the show aired, only 20% got it right. After the show aired, 78% got it right. 6 weeks after the show aired, still 68% still got it right. That's the power of television. We know that these mediums have a lot of reach, and they're global. They're mass audiences. The other thing is, we were talking about video games. That's another big marketplace that is a step behind Hollywood in its awareness. And a lot of times these are not intentional. A lot of times they're not approaching diversity out of, it's not even conscious. That's why I'm talking about when we go into writers' rooms, a lot of times we see that there isn't diversity in the room. So I'll tell you one story that a writer told me. She was a Latina. She's a screenwriter. She's written a couple of big films. She's also used to be an executive at one of the major studios before she turned to becoming a writer. She was brought in as a consultant. There was a show that had been picked up that was set in Miami, okay? South Beach. Well, everybody knows Miami, right? You get the feel, the culture. This show was going to be a police show. They shot the pilot, not one Latino in the show. Not even any perpetrators, no detectives, nothing. She goes in the room, she said, you know what we found? All white men were writing the show. They wrote themselves. What do you always hear as a writer? Write what you know. Well, they wrote what they know. So if your women are missing, if your diversities, ethnic groups are missing, you're probably not going to see them as often on the screen. Well, how quickly can we get those groups educated, employed, and in the room? In the meantime, you have people like us going in, making them aware, and providing access to information. Because a lot of times, like I said, it's not even a conscious thought. But whether it's a conscious thought or not, it's having impact. Because your audience, that's what they're learning, that's what they're taking away. And your average American, even if they're coming in contact with the Muslim, many times don't even know they're coming in contact with the Muslim. I grew up in the Midwest. I have a name that does not sound Arab or Muslim. It's not something that my family readily, it's not that they hide it, but it's not part of your everyday talk. So if you're not wearing garb that identifies you, and it's not part of your everyday conversation, and you don't have an accent, how does that impression come across? They have no idea what my background is. And so many times I would be at a table and somebody would be talking, and I'm not kidding, after 9/11, a whole group were talking and saying things that were very uncomfortable. And finally said, well, do you know any Muslims? Actually, yes, I do. So I'm hopeful that television and video games and new media, and I break video games and new media apart because they're separate industries, and art forms, but they do have, especially in the video gaming and television, they're massive industries that have global impact, and so there's something that have to stay in the spotlight and be addressed.
Well, I'm not an expert on entertainment television, but I do want to point out one thing that television has done to this country and that is it's tapped into the innate desire of most people, of many people, to listen to points of view they agree with. And that is where Fox News and NBC, I think, are doing real damage. MSNBC are doing real damage to this country. Playing to the lowest common denominator of the American people. No, not a lot of people are reading newspapers, but actually more people are reading newspaper journalism now than has ever happened because it's all free, which is what's destroying the industry. But I think it makes what journalists, actual journalists, print, radio, or television do more important because you have an anchor someplace to go to find out what is real and what is not just one blowhard's opinion.
This sort of brings up the other point that really became salient as the three of you were speaking, and that is the issue of money. I mean, how much of this is really about people with or sort of some sort of mass negative perception of Islam in the United States, and how much of it is really about people manipulating people's sentiments so as to gain some kind of political or gain politically or economically. I mean, if I can get millions of people to hate bottled water and somehow profit from it, then okay, bottled water is enemy number one. Have Muslims? I mean, is there some kind of real problem, or is this really about money at the end of the day?
I think it's an election issue right now, and there is some money involved, perhaps. But, when Barack Obama was elected, most Muslims were quite excited and happy and felt that that was a good thing. It might not be such a good thing for Muslims. Because there is really a group of people in the country who do have their fingers on keyboards, who are writing a lot, who have about somewhere around 30% of the country, so they say, convinced that Barack Obama is a Muslim in the White House.
Now, is that about anti-Muslim sentiment, or is this about just sort of gross and
it's
cynical
about
manipulation?
Well, I think it's about defeating Barack Obama by implicating him in something that is un-American. And then if you can link Islam to something that's un-American, well, then you've got your argument, don't you? And it isn't, I am really the last person to submit to conspiracy theory. I've resisted it all my life. I don't believe in it. I don't like it. I don't like where it takes you, even when it's right. And I still don't believe in it. But I do think that it's been proven, if you want to talk about money, that you can trace large infusions of capital into a few foundations that have as their primary interest someone else in the White House next time around. And some of those foundations are really, they are funding a lot of different efforts on this score, but some of them are really about how un-American and unpredictable, potentially violent Islam and Muslims really are. And I tried to capture a little bit on the radio. Those people are serious.
Well, they are American extremists, and every country has its extremists.
That's true. That's true. And as you pointed out, they now have the microphone in a way that they never used to. It's very unsettling.
In the American media, not just my part of it, the media has always had a villain that it could write about without anybody fighting back. For a long time, it was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union died. From 1979 to this day, you can write or say anything about Iran, and nobody's going to go after you. It's obviously an extremely evil country. And that's where Islam sat for a good while after 9/11, but I think the storyline is growing tired for a lot of people.
I agree. Yeah.
I agree. I also don't think that part of it is about money. I think that in entertainment, though, money definitely comes into play. For example, what you're talking about, they're looking for a bad guy. They need a villain. I think Hollywood, as far as movies and television, have been brought under the spotlight often enough because of that, like I said, they've taken a step back a little bit, and you're seeing them reassess how they work those storylines and how they work those characters. So if you've noticed in the last few years, corporate America has become the evil villain in a lot of movies. So that is the bad guy right now, or one of the newer bad guys being introduced into the narrative. I think if you look at video games, which I said is maybe where Hollywood was maybe 10, even 20 years ago, then money comes into it, but not in a manipulative way. It becomes about, for example, I was talking to one video game company, and the current conflicts in war are in Afghanistan and Iraq. So sometimes that's where these shooter combat games are set. But I said, well, what about that? All of the people they're shooting at tend to look the same, and they're all, they're these, all the brown people, just kill them all. And they said, but yes, and there's trying to be adjustment, but when you look at least in a video game world, these game designs are very expensive, and they also take a lot of storage capacity. So this one image is easier for them than having to differentiate, right? The other thing is that, even in the protagonists, some of the games are starting to allow the person to change the look of them, whether it's skin color, some characteristics, hairline, because they know people want to go into these worlds and look like themselves or imagine that they're that person. But it's still very slow to change, and a lot of it does come down, especially in game design, and it comes down to functionality and what that is going to cost them. But I think as they become more and more educated and change those abilities, and as, like I said, game applications change and different types of games are being formed. For example, Arabic is one of the fastest growing languages on Facebook right now. And that's not to say they're already on Facebook, but they're using English. But the Arabic language actually is in the top 10 languages in Facebook. Turkish is also. And a lot of those games are being developed for those marketplaces. And as they also come back this way, as those games are popular and transfer back this way, you'll see some of that change. And then the last thing I'll say about TV and film, there are no co-productions in the United States. In other countries, they look at film particularly as art, and the governments will create co-production funds. In the United States, it's your risk. You take the risk. So they're feeding what the public is going to buy. So you ultimately, as the consumer, have the final say, because what you'll buy is what they're going to feed you. And Avatar, which is something that is, they're blue people from another planet, and they made Earth and the military kind of the bad guy, or actually corporate. But if you look at most of the time, the big blockbusters are gonna, if we're gonna spend 20, 40, 60, 100 million in production, where can we get it back? And so that's really where fear of risk is coming from.
We have just a little bit of time to take some questions from the audience.
I wonder about that. Well, as long as I was a newspaper reporter, which was 32 years, every newsroom I was in was trying to bring in more black people to begin with, and then Asians. And the truth was that for a long time, college-educated black people didn't want to go into journalism because there were many more higher-paying professions they could enter where they were not well represented. I wonder, though, whether it is appropriate to ask a black person to cover racial issues, or I don't know. It's a question. For a long time, the New York Times would not allow a Jewish person to sit in the bureau chief chair in Israel. And then Tom Friedman got the job because this is a long time ago, and obviously this has changed. Tom Friedman got the job because he had covered the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and had seemed to give a fair accounting of it. He won a Pulitzer Prize, by the way, one of his 3, and so they gave him the chair in Jerusalem. And then I came next, and I was not of the faith, and every single person since then has been Jewish. So I absolutely believe that the newsroom ought to be more diverse, and why not send an Asian person to cover something that's not Asian to get a different perspective on it? There are all kinds of permutations from this, and there is no perfect answer to it, but I absolutely agree that newsrooms need to be more diverse.
I lost.
Well, just one thing. I do see in the New York Times in the last 5 to 10 years a lot more Middle Eastern sounding names as reporters, often as co-writers or co-authored, however you say that. Is that linguistic? Is that because they've got the language in?
Well, there are 2 reasons for that. One, a few years ago, the paper changed the byline rule that allowed you to have your assistant get a byline, assistant researcher and translator.
Oh, I see.
Second, most papers don't have almost no paper has any foreign staff any longer, but the big papers now also rely on people who used to be stringers, meaning that they fed material to reporters to be actually a reporter someplace where a reporter can't get. And having worked many years as an editor, that's not an editor's favorite thing to do.
Yeah.
But those are the 2 explanations for the more foreign-sounding names.
Thanks.
I lost credibility in the news back about 1960 when almost anything I read said that we could not find out what was going on in China while I had Chinese students going to class with me who had just recently arrived. 48 years ago, I climbed over the fence from the Dhahran Air Base in Saudi Arabia and spent 3 days wearing nothing but a t-shirt and slacks and shoes, walking around Bedouin camps, Al-Khobar, along the coast of the Gulf. And like every other country I visited, 30 countries that time, the people were all friendly with me. I hardly respect it when anyone says the people of the country are friendly. Naturally, people are friendly. A lot of people went out of their way to talk to me, possibly because I was an American. So when I got back to the air base, I like to mention a quote I was given, "Where were you?" And I said, "I wanted to see Saudi Arabia. Here we are." And they said, "You're not to go out there unless there are 2 of you and you're armed because those savages will slit your throat for the shirt off your back." So my impression has been ever since then that managers, that's the actual word for an euphemism often used. We call them leaders, but they're actually managers. They want to control things. They don't have control if all the people talk to each other. And there's no better example than Saudi Arabia because, the king there and our leaders didn't want anybody to mix with the other side. Okay, that's my story. Now the question I have is, and I can't find out, I read the Bible and I've seen castles all over Europe where anything it says in the Bible was violated. Is there such a thing as Sharia law where you can point to and say this is forbidden and this is not? I mean, as I understand it, Sharia law is different in different countries.
Yes, it's not only different in different countries, but it's, one way of looking at it in your terms, let's say, is family law, domestic law, the law of marriage, the law of getting along with each other. It's not criminal law, for instance, generally, anywhere that I know of. And, when you talk about the Sharia business in the United States, it's a red herring. There are laws on the books, including in the Constitution, which says that you cannot have a competing law in the country. There's already a law against, against this. To have a state resolution is, in my opinion, pure politics. and has nothing whatever to do with anything except creating, as I said, a kind of a wedge issue. Sharia is a long and very sophisticated traditional law that has been extrapolated over centuries of opinion and difference and conversation in many different countries, as you point out, but also there is some unity to it. And it's generally, one thing you need to remember about it is that it's essentially protecting the rights of people. It isn't cutting off hands. It's about protecting people's rights, the God-given rights, and there are a number of them in the legal basis. So there's such a misunderstanding about it, as we had of the word jihad a few years back. There seems to be one buzzword that is meant to send shivers down everyone's spine. Currently, it's Sharia. It wasn't too long ago, it was jihad, and I'm sure it was something before that. It bears a lot of resemblance to the Hakalah, to the Jewish law in many ways, in form and style as well. So is it something to fear? Absolutely not. Is it a competing law with the U.S. law? That's crazy. Of course not. I'm not sure I answered your question. One can also, as with all of these things, look it up. I mean, we are so lazy as Americans, and yet, there it is. It's in the Britannica. Look it up. It's online. There are reasonable definitions for all of these things. And, we tend to, I don't know why, eat the pablum we're offered, even when it's got poison in it. Take a look at the the actual books. It's not, as they say, Greek. You can understand it pretty easily. Scholars have been over this.
So you brought up various historical examples of discrimination against the Japanese, against African Americans, but it seems like there should be some kind of special quality to wartime fear. So have you found that perceptions, portrayals, even just level of attention paid to Muslim Americans has been correlated at all with perception and portrayals of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Question for Joel, perhaps.
Well, the coverage of the wars, certainly, we fought wars in Islamic countries for a long time. The coverage of these wars both dominated all form of media, so that certainly brought attention, particularly to the strains between the Sunni and Shiite in Iraq. But I think most of the attention to Islam resulted from 9/11, and that's where it got the negative tilt that it still has, though I believe that it's fading.
I remember when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, we were just on fire for the Mujahideen. We're like, these guys are awesome. We thought they were the greatest thing. And then now all of a sudden, that script has absolutely flipped. And so,
in many cases, we're fighting the very same people we were feeding before.
Yeah.
We have actually seen that, though, in entertainment. That, the Soviets was during the Cold War, so and with the conflicts going on in Afghanistan and Iraq, in entertainment, that was exactly what that event I showed you with THQ and the war specialists, because what we experimented with, or actually what we discussed and explored, was militainment, the rise of militainment. In other words, audience interest in narrative war, while audiences in real war, their interest is dropping. So the interest in news war and conflict is very small, but where it is in entertainment is very high. So what's causing this juxtaposition? And for me, I can't speak as an expert, but it's the glorification. There's not a whole lot that makes you feel as American or proud. Even recently on the news with the going in and getting Osama bin Laden spiked a lot of people's feelings of patriotism and things like that. And I just sat in a meeting. Actually, I'll back up. Stanley McChrystal came to a luncheon that I attended, And we talked about drones and drone warfare and things like that. And the military is utilizing video game technology in many ways, and they're using all the same hand movements. So basically the video game companies are training their future recruits. And the drone warfare, if the guy's sitting in Vegas and watching on a screen and literally deciding, boom, drop the bomb, we talked about this technology and how we're heavily investing into this. And what I asked General McChrystal was, how is this versus any kind of cultural training being given to these soldiers and what they're seeing before they're going into these countries? And he said, we have very little actually, but he said you will never, he really actually said that it's needed, and also that you'll never replace boots on the ground with drone, because you only have limited capabilities with a drone. You only have your eyes, what you're seeing. And one example he gave was we had a drone pick up 2 people in Afghanistan on the side of the road. It was about 1:30 in the morning. They were digging. And they picked it up on a drone, confirmed it, and dropped a bomb, took them out. Next day, they realized they were civilians. So they reported it, and they went to the president and said, I'm sorry, we took out 2 of your guys. When he saw the footage, he said, oh yeah, they're farmers, and their watering of their fields is on timers. And so they're digging to change the time. Well, we didn't know that. We didn't know that was their process. So not knowing that, those little bits of information will always make a big difference. But I do think that a lot of this feeding into entertainment, it's kind of circular. And also what we're finding in these dinners where we're bringing in policy is entertainment does impact our foreign policy and vice versa. So there is a connection to this. So it has more impact than what you'd sometimes think.
I loved that last discussion. It was so great. I was going to ask a similar question, so I had to quickly think of another one. Thank you. That was great. Thank you. And also just a quick tidbit based on what you just said. I was just in Afghanistan, and the State Department has created these deck of cards for the soldiers to play with that are cultural heritage cards. Anyway, it was really neat. It's one of many programs that's going on, but it was this small drip in the bucket.
Oh my gosh, that's great.
And it was very encouraging. It seems to me that a lot of our talk about Islam is focused on other countries. And your account of growing up in Oakland and knowing Islam as this local, personal phenomenon. I guess my question has 2 parts. Do you think it's important for people to tell the American stories of Islam in order to have it be a compassionate, empathetic experience? And then also, what kind of ratio do you see between Islam as a remote, international, other nation phenomenon versus a local one?
Well, those are great questions, and they are interrelated, for sure. And, the first one, really, storytelling about things Muslim in the United States is extremely important, and kind of, in a way, what I was talking about with the television broadcasting, to see well-watched weekly programming on occasion. There's 7 or 8 million Muslims in the United States. I mean, I don't look for, nor do I think there really should be a program with a Muslim, all about Muslims. I mean, I wouldn't see the point, really. I think, in fact, that would kind of be exoticizing or particularizing to a point that is maybe not necessary. The point of the matter is that Muslims, like many, many other groups, take part in the society. There are doctors, there are lawyers, there are teachers, there are care nurses, they are taxi cab drivers, etc. So from time to time, as they do take part, they could take part in the storytelling as well. That's sort of the area that I think would be a very useful socially, and make for more interesting storytelling. You know, the other side of it, we all tend to, and I speak for American Muslims as well as not, you know, to be influenced by things that are going on 10,000 miles away, over which we have no control, whether we're Muslims or whether we're Americans living in Peoria. We have no control over these things. They are happening. Our government is making decisions. Decisions are being made there. It's really out of our hands in many ways. To be mistaken, I spent a lot of time traveling in Africa, and I was often mistaken for my flag, you know, in unpleasant ways, considered the ugly American. I had a friend who always said he was Canadian. I never stooped to that, but, but I got the point. And here it's, you know, it's possible for an African-American Muslim with a Muslim name to be somehow mistaken in a certain way for, I don't know, someone who's tossed a bomb in Baghdad or whatever, you know. So that's a complicated issue. A third of the Muslims in the United States are African American. A third of the Muslims in the United States were born here. A third of them, well, many of that third go a long way back in American history, much further than many of us here. So it's hard to remember these things when we're actually living our, you know, our daily lives. So it's these little pieces of information made into story that I believe ultimately will kind of normalize relations a little better. Make it a little less hard for the 7th grader on the schoolyard, you know, lot to keep from being beaten up on Tuesday afternoon because he's got a funny name. The same American experience that all of us have lived, or our generationally, our forebears have lived from time to time, you know. So those are great questions, both of them. Thank you.
I'd love to add to that. Yes, I think it's really important that we bring in the American Muslim narrative. I think that it's, to me, it seems like the easiest reach. But sometimes when we've gone into rooms, the response we get is, wow, this is so great, and oh, wow, we'd love to use this, but, you know, our story isn't about war. You know, and you're like, well, yeah, we know, you know, but they just don't have any experience or where to put this. The other thing I had was a producer talk to me and have a really big show and say, yeah, but, and I won't say where, but our story's based in like Iowa. No Muslims there, you know? And you're like, well, actually there are. It's not a stretch, you know, the oldest mosque in the country is in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So there's all kinds of opportunities, but if the writer is not exposed to that or has no visual for it either, because they're just as, I mean, they're a cross-section of what you see in across the United States too. And they're also only exposed to what they've seen in their culture and their media. So unless they have personal experience, such as yours. So if they don't have that personal experience, what do they have to pull from? You know, and these are the stories that need to be told. And actually, my hope is that it'll be the easiest thing for them to tell, because as one studio executive asked us, how will you know when you're successful? How will you know you're successful? What's your benchmark? And my response is, when you can turn on a television and see a program and see someone of that background or religion, and the story has absolutely nothing to do with that they're just part of the story, and the story is the story. And so maybe they have a name, or maybe it nuances the character, or maybe, you know, it's Ramadan and something they do triggers that. That's it, you know? And so, yes, in answer to your question, I think, you know, an American Muslim story or having those stories incorporated are very important. It's just getting them in that is going to be, you know, the push.
You know, there was another of these Pew Research studies that was published this summer on American Muslim attitudes toward the United States, and I found the result kind of surprising, because more than 80% said they were very happy living here and found their communities friendly and welcome places to live. And I was researching something I was writing, and I came across Tawfiq Hamid, who is a fellow at the Potomac Institute in Washington, who is a self-described former Egyptian Islamic extremist. That's how he describes his past. And he said, late last year, he wrote a column somewhere, I've forgotten where, in which he said, moderate Islam has to stand up. Moderate Islam needs to stand up and be noticed all across the world. Well, that's what the Arab Spring was. You didn't hear anybody in any of these nations standing up and protesting, calling for Islamic jihad or anything extremist. These were people who wanted dignity, prosperity, freedom, and democracy in that order.
But it was striking too, you know, from very far away. It struck me how much of the story was about the way that they were using social media to organize these political movements. It wasn't so, I mean, I really feel, I don't know what the ratio would be, but it seems that the story was more about, look at how they're using social media. That's the story, not so much, this is what they're fighting for.
Right.
Well, you know what? That was the story in Northern California primarily.
Right, yeah, I was here.
The truth is that in Egypt, 5% of the people have internet access, probably far fewer have smartphones. The first demonstration, I think it was January 17th, I've forgotten the exact date. The first organization was organized through social media, and it was relatively small. But Al Jazeera saw this and began broadcasting, and then everybody in Egypt saw it on Al Jazeera, not from their smartphones.
That's right. That's good. Time for one last question. Oh, no, okay.
I have a question.
Yes, okay, good.
Oh, you've been sitting there a long time. I'm sorry.
I'm helping out with the event, but I also had a question. So I grew up in Virginia as a young Muslim American, and my family moved to the U.S. from Bangladesh 2 months after 9/11. So personally, I never really faced any discrimination as a Muslim, but I always grew up with this pressure to like always be the perfect, just kind of like set a good example because there was so much bad stuff about Muslims on media, and so I was always told growing up like, oh, you have to be the model, you have to go out and show people that we're good people. And I think that puts a lot of mental pressure on young kids. But at the same time, it motivates people. And I think my question kind of is that as we're growing up and becoming young professionals in the US, like, what is our role in shaping this media? Like, if we're, like, most of us are probably not going to go into being producers or movie directors or something, but how do we as professionals, like, take charge of this and have this momentum that we say, like, no, we want to change the way that Muslims are portrayed in the media and make it better for kids who come after us?
Well, I can think of a couple of ways immediately. Television and radio stations regard a letter as an opinion from 1,000 people. They don't respond to letter campaigns. If you try to organize this, they're very sensitive to that. But if an individual makes his opinion or her opinion known in a media setting about a program you've seen, you want to see it again, or don't ever show me something like that again, with reasons why, that's actually a very effective process. It's a very effective thing to engage in as an individual. You are an ambassador. Sorry. And you seem to be doing it very well. Congratulations. But, it is part of what it's all about. So you are an ambassador. The other thing is you can always write me a check,
Well, you grew up in one of the less tolerant states in the United States. I've spent much of my life there.
But Charlottesville, though. Charlottesville,
Oh,
Virginia.
that's the
that's
single, that and Northern Virginia are the only liberal communities in the state.
I would like to add to that. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, please.
I agree with what Michael said, and this is something that I encourage our communities to do all the time. Many of the Muslim communities, or the Muslims that I know, they come over if they're not born here, and they many times come from either oppressive countries or places where they were not able to do as well as here. And they focus on that, and they don't want any trouble, and they want to just live and do well and have their families thrive and be educated in a profession that they approve of, like law or medicine or engineering. So I tell them a few things. One, as Michael said, you don't have to write him a check, but support your organizations. What he was talking about, moderates, be active, be vocal. It's helpful. You know, MOST is not an advocacy group. We don't shame or blame. And that's why we do what we do well, because they will call on us. We never slap a hand that reaches out. You know, whatever they write, they write. That's the beauty of this country. We give them information. We give them access to experts. We give them access to living examples, but then they take it where they want, and that's the way it should be. However, you have that ability and have to have a voice. And if you don't use your voice, just like what you're seeing in the Middle East, you know, these Arabs are finally finding their voice and expressing it. And what we're hearing from Egypt now is they're struggling with the same things. Should they become political? Is that selling out? How do they do that? I mean, they're going to have to evolve over many years. So stay active, stay vocal, and support your organizations. And if you happen to have a friend or a child or somebody that is creative bent or is interested in those, support them, because oftentimes the Muslim communities don't support the arts and don't encourage their children to go into those, even video gaming, which is a huge marketplace right now. They don't even think of it, you know, and having said that, we need them in those, nobody's gonna tell the story better about if you don't define yourself, you know that quote, if you don't define yourself, somebody else will. So no, it's really needed. So those would be my words to you. And also I want to add one last thing to that. In the flip side, because of what we've been talking about, I'm on the board of the Arab Film Festival, and recently we had a filmmaker from Morocco come. It was his first time to Los Angeles, but because of our movies and our video games, he was scared. He thought it was going to be very violent and everybody would have guns. And I said, you're coming from Morocco and you're afraid of being in the United States? So those images, and they go both ways. And those perceptions and that impact of perception goes both ways. So I wanted to add that.
I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco, and nobody messed with me.
Yeah.
You know, it was just, I'm not an imposing person at all, but they'd find out he's American. Don't mess with him, man. You know, he could be armed. You don't know what he's capable of.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Those people will do anything. You know?
Exactly.
It's very much that. Yeah. Great, wonderful question, and I think that's all we have time for. And so, thank you everyone for turning up for this, and thanks to our panelists.